Most of us spend the largest portion of our lives wearing our organizational hat. So, for our life to be filled with purpose, we need our organizational lives to be filled with God's purpose. To make this connection, we need a missing link in Christian understanding. We need to grasp that God has a purpose for the organization itself. And this is the message of Redeeming Babel, that God indeed has a purpose for all organizations. God's purpose connects even to secular organizations like the ones many of you work for. And you can make progress towards grasping this purpose wherever you are now. Whether you're in the captive, consumer, or committed stage, you are invited on a journey towards becoming someone commissioned by God, motivated by His purpose for your organization. What is God's purpose for human organizations? Today's session will fill out this important new piece. We will introduce the big idea that God intends for human organizations to bear His image. Image bearing is God's purpose for all human organizations, including secular organizations. Today's session goal is to recognize how your organization images God, especially by the internal relationships within your organization. The idea that human organizations are to image God probably is a new idea for many of you. But the idea that human beings are to image God shouldn't be new. Scripture conveys this basic truth from the very beginning. Genesis 1 verse 27 declares, "Then God said, 'Let us make humans in our image, after our likeness.'" The problem is that Christian teaching has historically assigned this image-bearing purpose to only a select collection of human identities, namely the individual, the family, the friend, and the church. Because we believe those identities image God, we wear those hats with one set of attitudes. In contrast, Christian teaching has historically excluded the organization from the image of God collection. And because we don't believe the organization images God, we wear that hat with a different set of attitudes. Let me illustrate how this difference plays out. I've found that many Christians hold a cynical attitude about their organizational life, often especially if they work for a secular organization. In fact, people often stay stuck in the consumer stage precisely because of this cynicism. People arrive at their cynicism through negative experiences with flawed organizations. And if you've worn an organizational hat for any length of time, you too probably have experienced organizational flaws. Flaws like organizations that care too much about money, mistreat their members, are drifting aimlessly, or are dysfunctional in how they operate. Experiences of flawed organizations lead to a cynical attitude because of a belief, namely the belief that organizations are hopeless in their flaws. If you believe something is hopeless in its flaws, that there's no possibility of redemption, then of course your attitude should be cynicism. And you would be smart to go no further than the consumer stage. You should only extract from that thing what you want and toss aside hope for anything more. If you share this cynical attitude towards organizations, I have an important question for you. Why is it then that you don't embrace a similar cynical attitude in the other parts of your life? I want you to do a little thought experiment. Take those same flaws that you've experienced with organizations and imagine them occurring in the identities that you've been taught do belong in the image of God collection. For example, can you imagine ways that your own individual self might care too much about money? Do you get anxious and fearful of not having enough? Do you envy those who have more money than you? Or have you experienced ways that your own family or other families have mistreated their members? Have you seen how families can be really messed up with favoritism, resentments, and irritations? Or do you know friends who are drifting aimlessly, who have not gotten their act together? Or have you been in churches that suffer from some dysfunction in how they operate? I'm sure you've experienced or at least witnessed such flaws. Yet, what if I encouraged you to have a cynical attitude in those parts of your life? Suppose you're single and I told you that all families are flawed, so you should give up on the hope of having your own family. Or what if I encouraged you to adopt a consumer relationship with your friends? Like, just give them no more than what is needed to extract from them what you want. And what if I scoffed at the idea that you as an individual could get more connected to God's purpose? Because, well, let's face it, look at all your individual flaws. There's no hope for you. If you've been at all shaped by Christian teaching, you would reject my call to cynicism. You would hold on to a sense of hope for yourself as an individual, for your family, friendships, and church, even as you were aware of all the flaws present. Why such different attitudes? Why do the same flaws lead to hope in some parts of your life and to cynicism in another? The reason is because you have become convinced that the individual, the friend, the family, the church are made in the image of God, and that what God has made in His image, God will eventually redeem. That's the essence of the gospel. Our God will repair and restore His images. This is why we wear those hats, even with all the flaws present, with hope. So, if you are someone that currently feels cynical about organizations, I have a question for you. Would your attitude change if you became convinced that organizations were also made in the image of God? I hope you will come to believe this, because this, in fact, is what Scripture teaches. Even though the church has often missed this teaching, Scripture teaches that human organizations were indeed made in the image of God. The clearest expression is found in Colossians 1:15-17. Take a moment and read carefully this passage along with me. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created, on heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Colossians is teaching the fundamental truth that everything has been created by God, so every created identity is meant to image God. And this is especially true of all things human. This is because Jesus is, as Colossians says, the firstborn of all creation. Jesus is the primary, truest image of God in creation. And because Jesus is human like us, we humans are therefore meant to share in a very special way this image-bearing purpose. This is why we believe rightly that human identities such as individual, family, friend, and church do image God. But here's the surprising thing. Go back to the passage from Colossians. Notice which human identities are especially emphasized as images of God by the passage. Colossians doesn't say, and hey, don't forget, individuals, friends, families, and churches serve as images of God. No. The human identities intentionally emphasized are thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. Thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. That's biblical language for the defining organizations of the day. It is organizations that are specifically named as the things created through Him and for Him and meant to image God. It's as if Colossians anticipates our mistake of excluding organizations from the image of God collection, and so goes out of the way to correct our thinking preemptively, to say, hey, remember, organizations are also images of God. This biblical view of organizations is all-encompassing. Note when Colossians describes thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, it includes both the visible and invisible. Your organization is not comprised of just the buildings, equipment, or people visible to the eye. It also has an invisible spiritual identity to it. And all things means all, which means that all organizations, including secular organizations, also have this deeper, invisible spiritual identity that is meant to point towards God. The last verse of the passage is then critical, and he is before all things. Again, Colossians is saying all human organizations ultimately originate from Jesus and thus bear his image. And in him all things hold together. Colossians is saying that all the ways that organizations are broken and flawed will ultimately be put back together by Jesus. Jesus' redeeming hands holds not just flawed individuals, families, friends, and churches. Jesus also holds flawed organizations, including flawed secular organizations. And because Jesus is holding our organizations within his redemptive reach, we too can hold our organizational hats with hope. Colossians is not the only scripture that teaches that organizations are made in the image of God and therefore participate in redemption. We'll be covering many more passages the rest of this course. But Colossians is perhaps the clearest expression of this core biblical truth. To repeat this truth one more time, all organizations are made in the image of God, which means all flawed organizations are held in Jesus' redeeming power. And this, in turn, calls us to the very opposite of cynicism. It calls us to hope. The rest of this course is designed to help you more consciously recognize the image of God in organizations and participate in this hope for redemption. We're going to get started during this session by looking at how organizations image God in their internal relationships. Internal relationships define the true nature of any organization. When someone asks you, hey, what's your organization really like? Your answer will likely include the traits describing the relationships between you and your colleagues, you and your supervisor, between departments, and so on. Here then is the genetic resemblance to God. God also is defined by his inner relationships. The Christian definition of God is that God himself is comprised of the relationships between the Father, Son, and Spirit. God is one being comprised of multiple inner relationships. One being comprised of multiple inner relationships. Do you catch the resemblance? That's precisely what an organization is. One being comprised of multiple inner relationships. And the qualities of those inner relationships define the true nature of the being. This is how organizations are made in God's image. To repeat, the best way to understand your organization is to understand the internal relationships in your org chart. Similarly, the best way to understand God is to understand the internal relationships of the Trinity. So, how would we depict the relationships between the Father, Son, and Spirit? Scripture is full of many descriptions of this inner life of God. Christian teaching throughout the centuries, starting with the early church fathers, has reflected deeply on Scripture and presented various ways to summarize the triune relationships. I'm going to name 3 main traits that are consistently highlighted in the history of church teaching and in Scripture. 3 defining traits of Trinitarian relationships are interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose. Interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose. They comprise what could be called the Trinitarian DNA. These 3 relational qualities define how the Father, Son, and Spirit relate to one another. If you like abbreviated memory tools, you could remember this Trinitarian code as IOS. IOS is the ideal operating code for all organizational beings. Since all organizations, including secular organizations, are created by God, they bear God's code. They've been imprinted by this Trinitarian DNA. This is a key clue to their purpose. The internal relationships of organizations are meant to image the internal relationships of the Trinity. Organizations are meant to exhibit the same type of interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose. Now, of course, The people in an organization, especially if it's a secular organization, may not realize they are imaging God. The members may not even believe in God. But something is still capable of imaging God, even if it is not intentionally choosing to do so, or even if it does not consciously believe in God. Think of something beautiful in nature, or a beautiful cathedral, or even a baby. They all serve as images of God, even though they've not intentionally chosen to do so. They don't even consciously believe in God. In the same manner, secular organizations can still unknowingly image God as long as they exhibit internal relationships of interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose. They still reflect God's good and beautiful character to people. And this is why you have taken joy in participating in certain organizations. For instance, you may have loved working at a company because you and your colleagues could really depend on each other. And you may have given credit to the organization for that sense of joy. But the real credit belongs to God. When you were participating in those interdependent relationships, you were actually reflecting the triune God, the one that you most deeply love. That's why you experienced joy. You were worshiping the Father, Son, and Spirit. You were imaging God in your organizational life, even if, like your secular colleagues, you may not have even been fully aware of what you were actually doing. Now, keep in mind also that an organization doesn't have to be a perfect image in order to reflect God. God can use flawed organizations to image himself, just like he can use flawed individuals, families, friends, and churches. Scripture itself demonstrates how flawed secular organizations can image the Trinitarian DNA. For example, when writing his letter to the Christians in Philippi, Paul is trying to convey Trinitarian interdependence, specifically how the relationships of his audience should reflect the interdependence between the Father and the Son. You can imagine Paul at his desk thinking, what image can I use so that my readers really grasp this kind of interdependence found in God? Perhaps Paul rifled through his mental collection of different possible images. And then Paul thinks, I know. For his image, he picks a secular organization, one that all of his readers would have recognized. In fact, they would have recognized it as a deeply flawed, even hated organization. It is the Roman army. In Philippians 1, verses 27 to 30, Paul has his readers imagine the organizational practice of the Roman army, marching to battle in their customary locked shield formation, and he says essentially, that is the image of Trinitarian interdependence that should shape your imagination. Or take the example from the book of Hebrews. Throughout this letter, the unknown author draws on one image after another from the collection of Jewish religious practices. But interestingly enough, when the author reaches the climax of the book in Hebrews 12 and wants to convey the Trinitarian trait of shared purpose, he calls upon another entity that is the equivalent to today's secular organization. He has his readers imagine the Greco-Roman sports team and how team members share a common purpose of finishing the race together. Now again, those team members were not consciously imagining the Trinity, and yet Scripture still presents them as powerful images nevertheless. And by the way, this is why cheering on sports teams can feel like a religious experience. Because in a very real sense, it is a religious experience. When we watch a close-knit team finally win the championship and hug joyously on the field, we are watching an image of the shared purpose between Father, Son, and Spirit. Now keep in mind, your organization will certainly be a mixed image of God. In some aspects of its internal relationships, it will be properly imaging the Trinitarian DNA. It will be a faithful image. Those are the aspects that you do like. That will be where the organization seems to be operating at its best. In other relational aspects, it will be a flawed image. Those are the aspects of the organization that you don't like. And those are areas where the organization seems to be operating out of step. What then are you supposed to do in response? What each of you are called to by God may differ depending on the current stage in your journey towards commission. For instance, if you're in the captive stage, I suggest that your next step is to find some way to get out of this stage. This may mean actually getting out of your current organization. If your organization is so deeply flawed that you can't even detect the Trinitarian DNA, it may mean that you need to leave. Now, the redeeming power of Jesus encompasses even the most flawed organizations, but sometimes redemption means God must first bring judgment. And Scripture has multiple examples where God's judgment of an institution involves His people embarking on an exodus from that institution. If for some reason you feel you can't exit the organization itself, I suggest that minimally you pursue an exit from the captive relationship and perhaps seek a consumer relationship. Pursuing a fairer exchange from your organization at least gives you some agency and purpose and brings you a step closer to God's ultimate desire for you. If you're in the consumer stage, I suggest that the goal should be to grow out of a merely self-interested exchange-based relationship. So, how can you grow in relating to your organization as an image of God? I suggest that this will involve you cultivating your affection, loyalty, appreciation, and yes, even love of your organization as an image of God. The best place to do this is in your internal relationships. So the question for you is, how can you enter into more Trinitarian imaging relationships? For instance, can you do work where others will depend on you and where you can depend on others? Can you join a team that is known for having a strong sense of shared purpose? Or which people in your organizations reflects the biblical qualities of love? Can you find a way to work with and for those people? Such moves could be very well worth it, even if it doesn't lead to an immediate promotion or salary increase. And by the way, if you can't find relationships that image God more fully, then for you too, it may be time to ask God, is it time for an exodus? You may need to find another organization that has more potential to image God faithfully. For those of you who already feel committed to your organization because you appreciate some organizational qualities, your next step would be to discern an actual assignment from God within your organization. The question for you would be not just what do you currently appreciate about your organization, but also what don't you appreciate? In other words, where does it need repair? Look for relationships where the interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose need to be strengthened. Those might be the places where Jesus is calling you to participate in His work of redemption. And later on in this course, we'll explain more about God's plan of repair and how you are called to play a role. Finally, if you already sense that God has sent you into your current organization with a specific purpose, you probably are already participating in Jesus' repair project. You are already actively involved in the restoration of internal relationships so that they more fully reflect the Trinitarian DNA. So the question for you is, what repair help do you need? Do you need tools, partners, advice, or prayer support? Begin to ask God for additional resources to continue the work of repair in your organization. In this session, we learned how organizations image God in their internal relationships. In the next session, we will explore how organizations image God in their external relationships and how you can participate in God's purposes in the world.